You are the only one who can save him." The words hung in the air like an inevitable sentence, echoing through the corners of the luxurious room where one of the most powerful men in the country fought his final battle. The heart monitor showed an increasingly irregular rhythm, as though even Richard Sterling's heart was rebelling against the weight of that final decision. Emma Collins felt the world spin around her. In her 15 years as a nurse, she had learned to maintain emotional distance from her patients, but something in that moment transcended all the professional barriers she had so carefully built. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the medical equipment, trying to process what she had just heard. The storm raging outside the mansion seemed like the perfect prelude to the turmoil about to unfold. Through the large windows of the room, occasional lightning illuminated Richard's face, revealing a steely determination that not even the proximity of death could erase. "Mr. Sterling," Emma began, her voice betraying a mix of disbelief and concern, "you're not thinking clearly. The medications." "I've never been clearer in my life," Richard interrupted her, his voice weak but full of authority. With visible effort, he adjusted himself in the pillows, his eyes fixed on hers with an unsettling intensity. "Emma, you've spent the last 6 months taking care of me, but more importantly, you've shown me something I've been searching for decades. Authenticity." Emma felt her heart tighten. At 35, she had faced more prejudice and judgment than she cared to admit. Her curvaceous body and common appearance always seemed to attract disdainful looks in the elite world where she worked. But Richard Sterling had been different from day one, treating her with a respect that went beyond mere professional courtesy. "Thomas is lost," Richard continued, referring to his only son. "He lives in a world of appearances, surrounded by people as empty as the parties he attends. My son has become exactly the kind of person I feared most. Someone who confuses worth with price." A particularly loud thunderclap made the windows tremble, as if underlining the gravity of the moment. Emma knew Thomas Sterling only through celebrity magazines and social columns. The coveted Playboy, heir to an empire, always photographed with models on yachts or at exclusive parties. His rare visits to his sick father were brief and tense, as if the mere sight of mortality bothered him deeply. "What exactly are you asking me?" Emma asked, though a part of her already knew the answer, and that same part was terrified of the implications. Richard took a deep breath, each word seeming to cost him immense effort. "My lawyer will come tomorrow with the will. In it, there's a special condition. Thomas will only receive his inheritance if he agrees to marry you for 6 months." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Her mind spun with thousands of thoughts simultaneously, all of them screaming how absurd the idea was. "This is madness," she finally managed to say, her voice trembling. "Your son would never accept something like that. And I'm not the kind of woman who deserves to be happy?" Richard interrupted her, his voice suddenly stronger. "Who deserves to be loved for who she really is and not for what she appears to be. Emma, you are exactly the kind of person my son needs in his life. Someone who sees beyond appearances, who understands that a person's true worth is in their actions, not in their bank account." Emma walked to the window, watching the storm that seemed to mirror the turmoil inside her. Her mind went back to all the times she had been judged for her appearance, to all the moments she had to prove her worth twice as much as anyone else. And now, this man, this titan of business reduced to a desperate father, was essentially offering her a chance to flip this world upside down. "Thomas has no choice," Richard continued, his voice now softer. "He's never worked a day in his life. Without the inheritance, he wouldn't survive a month with the lifestyle he leads. But this isn't about money, Emma. It's about saving my son's soul before it's too late." Emma turned to face him, noticing how the light in the room seemed to form a halo around his frail figure. "Why me? Of all the people in the world, why did you choose me?" "Because you have something money can't buy," Richard smiled weakly. "You have the ability to see beauty where others only see imperfection. To find strength in vulnerability. To turn simple moments into precious memories." He paused, struggling to catch his breath. "You do this every day, Emma. With your patients, with the children in the social project you voluntarily coordinate, with all the lives you touch without even realizing it." Silent tears began to trickle down Emma's face. She thought about her own journey, the battles she fought to accept herself, to find her worth in a world obsessed with impossible standards. She thought about Thomas, this man who represented everything she had learned to distrust in the world of the rich and famous. And she thought about Richard, this father who, in his final moments, was trying to build a bridge between two seemingly incompatible worlds. "Promise me, Emma," Richard's voice was now only a whisper. "Promise you'll try. Not for the money, not for the inheritance, but for the chance to show Thomas that there's a world beyond the parties and the appearances. That there's beauty in authenticity, strength in vulnerability, and that a person's true worth cannot be measured by Instagram followers or zeros in a bank account. The heart monitor began emitting a more erratic sound, as if even the machines could feel the intensity of the moment. Emma moved closer to the bed, holding Richard's hand in hers. "I promise," she replied, her voice firm despite the tears. "I promise I'll try." A peaceful smile illuminated Richard's face. "Thank you," he whispered, his eyes beginning to close. "Now I can leave knowing I gave my son the greatest inheritance I could leave. The chance to find his true self." The storm outside began to subside, as if nature itself recognized the solemnity of the moment. Emma stayed by the bed, holding Richard's hand, a silent witness to the moment when one of the country's most powerful men left this world, leaving behind not just a fortune in money, but a legacy of transformation that was only beginning to unfold. That night, as the last raindrops fell outside, Emma Collins couldn't imagine how that promise would change not only her life, but also the life of a man she had yet to meet, a man who needed to learn that true love doesn't fit into any societal mold. The office of lawyer Marcus Reynolds exuded a suffocating atmosphere that autumn morning. Emma sat quietly in the farthest corner of the room, her body tense, reflecting the anxiety that had consumed her since Richard's death 3 days ago. The scent of leather and aged wood filled the space, mingling with the almost palpable tension in the air. The heavy oak door swung open abruptly, and Thomas Sterling entered like a contained storm. Emma felt her heart skip a beat. The photos in the magazines didn't do justice to his imposing presence. Tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored Italian suit, every detail of his appearance meticulously crafted to exude power and sophistication. His eyes, the same intense blue as his father's, swept the room until they landed on Emma. For a fleeting moment, something resembling confusion crossed his face, quickly replaced by a mask of studied indifference. He sat as far away from her as possible, as though her mere presence might contaminate the air he breathed. "Can we start?" His voice was cold, impatient. "I have an appointment in 2 hours." Marcus Reynolds adjusted his reading glasses, his face revealing a mixture of discomfort and resignation. "Thomas, I think you should cancel any appointments you have today. What we're going to discuss here? Well, it's going to require your full attention." Emma watched as Thomas's hands clenched slightly on the leather armchair. The first sign that his facade of indifference wasn't as solid as it seemed. "Before we proceed with the formal reading of the will," Marcus continued, pulling a sealed envelope from his folder, "your father left a letter that should be read first." The lawyer handed the envelope to Thomas, who stared at it as if it were a bomb about to explode. With fingers that trembled imperceptibly, he broke the seal. "My son," Thomas began reading aloud, his voice initially steady, "if you're reading this, it means my journey in this world has come to an end. But before I leave, I need to make one last attempt to save you from yourself." Emma noticed a vain pulse in Thomas's temple as he continued reading. "For years, I have watched you lose yourself in a world of appearances, becoming someone who measures the worth of people by the size of their bank accounts. You've surrounded yourself with people as empty as the parties you attend, and every day that passes, I see less of the sensitive dreamer boy you once were." Thomas paused, his jaw visibly tight. Emma could feel the emotional storm building inside him, even through his mask of composure. "That's why I made a decision that I'm sure you'll initially see as cruelty on my part, but that I hope one day you'll understand as my final act of love." The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas lifted his eyes from the letter, his gaze meeting Emma's for the second time. There was something wild in those blue eyes now, a volatile mixture of rage and disbelief. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Marcus Reynolds cleared his throat, uncomfortable. "Perhaps it's best if I proceed with the official terms of the will." What followed was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Emma watched Thomas's face go through a myriad of emotions as the lawyer outlined the conditions. The 6-month marriage to Emma as a requirement to receive the inheritance, the need to live together, the prohibition on maintaining parallel relationships during that time. "This is ridiculous," Thomas exploded, standing up so abruptly that his chair almost tipped over. "He can't do this to me. There has to be a way to contest." "The will is legally airtight," Marcus gently interrupted. "Your father ensured there were no loopholes." Thomas turned to Emma, his eyes flashing with fury. "And you? How much did he pay you to participate in this madness?" Emma felt her blood boil. All the anxiety she had felt up until that moment transformed into a burning indignation. She slowly stood up, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Your father didn't pay me anything." Her voice was calm, but laced with a strength that made Thomas blink. "He asked me to try and help a lost man find his way back to humanity. Now I see I may have been too optimistic." She walked to the door, but before leaving she turned one last time. "Do you know what the last thing your father said to me was? That beneath all this arrogance, there's a man too scared to be true to himself. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe there's nothing left beneath this facade." The impact of her words was evident. For a moment, Thomas's mask completely fell, revealing something vulnerable and lost in his gaze. Emma felt her heart tighten, remembering the promise she had made to Richard. But before either of them could say anything more, Marcus Reynolds intervened. "Thomas, you have exactly 1 week to decide. If you don't accept the conditions of the will, the entire estate will be donated to charity, except for a small monthly pension that would barely cover the rent of a modest apartment." Thomas ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair, a gesture that betrayed his desperation. "A week to decide if I marry a complete stranger? If I throw away everything I've ever known?" "No," Emma answered softly from the door. "A week to decide if you're ready to discover who you really are, without all these layers of pretension and superficiality." She paused, her eyes meeting his one last time. "Your father believed there was something valuable inside you, something worth saving. The question is, are you willing to find out if he was right?" With those words she left the office, leaving behind a completely destabilized Thomas Sterling. As she walked down the hallway, Emma felt the weight of the promise she had made to Richard stronger than ever. It wouldn't be an easy journey, but maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to fulfill the final wish of a father who loved his son so much that he risked his eternal happiness for a chance at salvation. The week that would follow would be only the beginning of a transformation neither of them was truly prepared to face. A journey that would force them to question everything they thought they knew about love, value, and the true nature of beauty. The Sterling mansion stood against the evening sky like a monument to solitude. Emma stopped before the wrought iron gates, her small suitcase feeling far heavier than it should. A week had passed since the reading of the will, and Lawyer Reynolds's call still echoed in her mind. Thomas had accepted the terms not by choice but by necessity. The impeccably kept garden seemed to whisper stories of past generations as she walked along the stone pathway. Red roses, Richard's favorite, framed the way, their sweet scent carrying a note of melancholy. Emma couldn't help but wonder how many times her former patient had walked this very path, dreaming of a different future for his son. The butler, a gray-haired gentleman named James, greeted her with a cordiality that couldn't completely mask his concern. His gentle eyes seemed to carry the weight of years spent watching the Sterling family slowly fragment. "Miss Collins," he murmured, leading her through the marble foyer. "Young Mr. Sterling is waiting for you in the library." There was something in his voice, a mixture of hope and apprehension, that made Emma's heart tighten. Each step through the opulent halls echoed with a history of privilege and tradition. Portraits of past generations of the Sterling family watched her passage with unblinking gazes, as if silently judging her presence in this sanctuary of wealth and power. But there was something more in the furtive glances of the staff she passed, a blend of curiosity and what seemed to be hope. "Mr. Richard spoke highly of you," James remarked softly as they ascended the grand staircase. "He said you had the gift of seeing beyond appearances." Emma felt her cheeks flush. "Richard was a very kind man." "He was a man who deeply loved his son," James replied, his voice laden with emotion. Even when Thomas did everything he could to push that love away. Before Emma could respond, they arrived at the double doors of the library. James hesitated for a moment as if he wanted to say something more, but instead, he quietly opened the doors. Thomas stood by the library window, a glass of whiskey in hand, the last rays of the sun casting dramatic shadows across his profile. The room was a perfect reflection of the duality within him. Old, valuable books lined the polished mahogany shelves, contrasting with celebrity magazines carelessly scattered on a side table. "So you really came," he said without turning, his voice carrying a note of bitterness that couldn't quite mask the underlying fear. The amber liquid in his glass trembled slightly, betraying the tension in his hands. "I made a promise to your father," Emma answered simply, setting her suitcase down. The soft thud echoed through the library, like a period at the end of an unspoken sentence. Thomas finally turned to face her, and something in his eyes made Emma's heart tighten. There was anger there, yes, but also a deep sadness he was trying to drown in the expensive whiskey. His immaculate clothes and casually studied posture seemed more like armor than style. "Do you know what's most ironic?" he asked, a humorless smile playing at his lips. "My father always said I needed to learn the value of things. And now here I am, being forced to marry to avoid losing everything. Quite the lesson in values, don't you think? Emma walked over to one of the bookshelves, her fingers gliding over the spines of the old books. The smell of leather and aged paper brought to mind the stories Richard had told her about his young son, who used to hide here, lost in imaginary worlds. Your father told me about this library, she said softly. How you used to spend hours here as a child, devouring adventure books. He said that your smile, when you found a particularly good story, would light up the entire room. The whiskey glass stopped halfway to Thomas's lips. For a moment, his mask of cynicism faltered, and Emma caught a glimpse of something vulnerable in his eyes, like a lost child searching for its way back home. Did he talk a lot about me? Thomas asked, his voice surprisingly soft. Every day, Emma replied, turning to face him. He never lost hope that the boy who loved stories of heroes still existed somewhere inside the man you've become. Thomas set the glass down on the table with unnecessary force, the sound echoing through the library like a gunshot. That boy died along with my mother, he said bitterly. And my father was too busy building his empire to notice. Or maybe, Emma gently suggested, he was trying to build something strong enough to protect both of you from the pain. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths. Thomas ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair, a gesture that made him momentarily seem younger, more vulnerable. James will show you to your room, he said finally, his voice returning to its usual coldness. The judge will be here tomorrow at 10 for the ceremony. Try not to be late. Emma was almost at the door when his voice reached her again, softer this time. Why did you really accept this? And don't tell me it was just for the promise. She stopped but didn't turn around. Because sometimes people need to get completely lost in order to truly find themselves. Your father wasn't trying to punish you, Thomas. He was trying to give you the chance to rediscover who you are, without all the pressures and expectations that shaped you up until now. That night, as Emma settled into her new room, a space larger than her entire old apartment, she heard a soft melody coming from somewhere in the mansion. Following the sound, she found Thomas in the music room, sitting at the old piano, his fingers gliding over the keys without actually touching them. The moonlight poured through the tall windows, casting shadows that danced across his face, revealing an expression she had never seen before. A mix of longing and fear, like someone standing on the edge of a cliff, hesitating between jumping or retreating. He used to play for me, Thomas spoke without turning, sensing her presence. Every night, no matter how late he got home from work. It was our time. His voice was different, softer, almost vulnerable. After Mom died, the music stopped. And something inside him, inside both of us, stopped too. Emma moved closer, slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal. The moonlight turned the moment into something almost magical, as if they were suspended in a space between reality and dream. Sometimes, she said softly, sitting beside him on the piano bench, the music doesn't really stop. It just waits for the right moment to start again. Thomas looked up at her, and for the first time since they had met, his defenses completely dropped. In that moment, there was no arrogant playboy, no rebellious air, there was only a lost man searching for his way back to the light. How are we going to make this work? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. How can two strangers, forced into an absurd situation, find, what? Redemption? Love. Emma gently pressed a key on the piano, the single note echoing through the room like a promise. One step at a time, she replied. Starting with being honest with each other. And maybe, just maybe, we'll discover we're not so strange to each other after all. The next morning, when Emma went down for breakfast, she found a single white rose on the kitchen table, along with a note written in elegant handwriting. Thank you for not giving up before we even started. Maybe you're right about the music, and about new beginnings. It was a small gesture, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But to Emma, it was like seeing the first rays of sunlight after a long night, a faint promise that perhaps there was still hope for Richard Sterling's lost son. And maybe, just maybe, this journey could heal not only Thomas but also the wounds she carried in her own heart. The white rose in her hands was more than just a flower, it was a symbol of possibilities, a hesitant first step toward something neither of them could yet name, but something that was already beginning to bloom in the empty spaces between their wounded hearts. The wedding ceremony was brief and cold, like a winter morning. Emma gazed at her reflection in the bedroom mirror, now wearing a ring that felt much heavier than the small band of gold suggested. The simple dress she had chosen stood in stark contrast to the luxurious surroundings of the mansion, just as she herself seemed out of place in this world of appearances and protocols. The first week of living together unfolded like an awkward dance between two strangers forced to share the same space. Thomas kept to his routine of social events and business meetings, arriving late and leaving early, as if the mansion had become a hostile territory he needed to avoid at all costs. It was on one of these lonely nights that Emma discovered the old photo album hidden on the top shelf of the library. The yellowed pages held fragments of a story different from the one Thomas was trying to project to the world. A little boy with bright eyes playing piano with his father, moments captured of genuine laughter, spontaneous hugs. That was before Thomas's voice surprised her. He was standing in the doorway of the library, still in his immaculate suit, but with his tie loosened and the top buttons of his shirt undone, signs of a long day. Before what? Emma asked softly, not taking her eyes off the photograph where an 8-year-old Thomas smiled, sitting at the piano next to his father. Before I understood how the world really works. He stepped forward, picking up one of the loose photographs. Before I discovered that genuine smiles are for naive children who still believe in fairy tales. Emma watched as his fingers caressed the photograph almost unconsciously. And when exactly did you decide you no longer deserved to be happy? The question caught him off guard. Thomas raised his eyes, meeting her gaze with a mixture of surprise and something deeper, more vulnerable. It's not about deserving, he replied after a moment. It's about survival. In this world, you're either the predator or the prey. There's no space for what? Authenticity? Real connection? Emma gently closed the album. It's interesting how you talk about survival when you're just existing, Thomas. Living a life as superficial as the parties you attend. She expected him to react with his usual defensiveness, but something different happened. Thomas sank heavily into one of the leather armchairs, suddenly looking exhausted. You don't understand, he said, his voice softer than usual. After my mother died, my father, he got lost in the pain. He drowned himself in work, building this empire as if it were a fortress against suffering. And me? I learned that the only way not to feel pain was to feel nothing. Emma moved closer, sitting in the armchair beside him. And how has that been working for you? Thomas let out a bitter laugh. Look at me. I have everything money can buy, and I'm married to a stranger because my father decided this was the only way to save me. Maybe, Emma suggested gently, your father realized you needed someone who couldn't be bought. Someone who could see beyond the facade you've so carefully built. The silence that followed was filled only by the ticking of the old clock and the distant sound of rain beginning to fall. Thomas stood up abruptly, walking over to the window. You know what's the scariest part? He asked without turning. It's that sometimes when you look at me like that, it's as if you really see me. Not the heir of the Sterlings, not the Playboy from the magazines, but just me. Emma stood up as well, her heart racing a little faster. And is that so bad? It's terrifying, he admitted, turning to face her. Because I don't know who I am anymore without all these masks. It was in that moment that Emma did something that surprised them both. She reached out, gently touching his face. Then maybe it's time to find out. The touch seemed to break something inside of Thomas. His defenses, so carefully built over the years, began to crumble like a sandcastle hit by the tide. He closed his eyes, allowing himself, perhaps for the first time in years, to simply feel. Help me, he whispered, his voice so low Emma almost didn't hear. To find that boy in the pictures? He never left, Thomas, she replied softly. He's just waiting for you to be ready to let him come back. That night, something subtly shifted in the dynamic between them. During dinner, for the first time since the wedding, Thomas truly spoke to her. Not about business or social commitments, but about memories, some sweet, others painful, that he had buried so deep he had almost forgotten them. My mother loved rainy days, he said as they shared a bottle of wine in the living room. She used to say it was nature's way of washing the world's soul. We'd sit here exactly where we are now, and she'd make up stories about every drop that ran down the window pane. Emma watched how his face softened as he spoke of his mother, the masks of arrogance and indifference giving way to something more genuine, more real. And after she passed, she asked gently. After, rain became just water falling from the sky, he replied, a sad smile tugging at his lips. It's funny how we lose the ability to see magic in simple things when our hearts are closed. Maybe, Emma suggested, standing up and walking to the window, it's time to relearn how to see. Thomas followed her, stopping beside her. Together, they watched the raindrops sliding down the glass, creating patterns that seemed to tell silent stories. That one, Emma pointed to a particularly large drop, seems to be carrying the weight of the world on its back. But look how it keeps moving forward, collecting other drops, growing stronger. For a moment, Thomas was silent. Then, to Emma's surprise, he pointed to another drop. "And that one seems to be dancing, doesn't it? Like it knows a secret no one else does?" The smile that lit up his face in that moment was genuine, a reflection of the boy in the photographs finding his way back to the surface. Emma felt her heart tighten with an emotion she dared not name. Later, when they said goodnight, Thomas hesitated for a moment. "Emma," he called, his voice laden with a vulnerability she had never heard before. "Thank you for helping me remember." "Remember what?" she asked softly. "How it feels," he simply replied before retreating to his room. Emma stayed awake for a long time that night, listening to the rain and reflecting on how sometimes the greatest transformations begin with the smallest gestures. A photo album, an honest conversation, raindrops telling silent stories. And perhaps, just perhaps, the real miracle wasn't turning Thomas Sterling into the man his father wanted him to be, but helping him rediscover the man he had always been, hidden beneath layers of pain and protection. The rain kept falling outside, washing the world as Thomas's mother used to say, and with it, the first layers of defense that had separated them began to slowly dissolve, revealing possibilities neither of them had dared to imagine before. The discovery came on a Sunday afternoon, when the mansion seemed quieter than usual. Emma was organizing some old boxes in the attic at James's request, when she found a leather-bound journal, its cover worn and faded. The name Elizabeth Sterling was engraved in gold letters, already dimmed by time. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the first page. Elizabeth, Thomas's mother, the woman whose absence had created such a deep void in her son's life. The elegant handwriting filled the pages with stories of love, hope, and, surprisingly, fear. "What are you doing?" Thomas's voice startled her. He was standing in the attic door, his expression a mixture of shock and something deeper, more painful. "Sorry," Emma began, closing the journal. "I was just—" "No," Thomas interrupted her, his voice oddly soft. He crossed the space between them, dust dancing in the light streaming through the small attic window. I didn't know this existed." Emma watched as he took the journal with a reverential care, as if holding something infinitely precious and terribly fragile at the same time. "Do you want me to leave?" she asked gently. Thomas hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. "Stay," he whispered. "Please?" Together, they sat on an old chest, the journal between them like a bridge over waters long unexplored. Thomas opened the first page with trembling fingers. "My dear Thomas," he read aloud, his voice thick. "If you are reading this, it means I was not able to win the battle I've been fighting in silence." Emma felt her heart tighten as the first tears fell down Thomas's face. Instinctively, she held his hand, offering silent support as he continued reading. The journal revealed a truth Thomas had never known. His mother hadn't just died from a sudden illness as he had always been told. Elizabeth Sterling had fought a silent battle with depression for years, hiding her pain behind graceful smiles and elegant parties. "Every smile of yours was my light in the darkness," Thomas read, his voice barely containing the emotion. "But the monster inside my mind kept growing, convincing me that you and your father would be better off without me." Emma watched as each word seemed to strike Thomas like a wave, washing away years of misunderstanding and revealing a far more complex and painful truth. "She loved me," he whispered as if making a profound discovery. "All this time I thought she left us because we weren't enough." "She loved you more than anything," Emma confirmed gently, pointing to a specific passage. "My greatest fear is not death, but that my son will grow up believing he is unworthy of love. Thomas, my angel, you have always been the greatest joy of my life." Tears now flowed freely down Thomas's face, years of hurt and resentment transforming into painful but necessary understanding. "My father never told me," he said, his voice breaking. "He just shut down. He stopped playing the piano, stopped smiling. I thought it was because she chose to leave us." Emma gently stroked the hand he still held. "Maybe he was trying to protect you from the pain. Sometimes, the people we love most make decisions thinking they're protecting us, even when those decisions end up causing more pain." Thomas closed his eyes, letting the tears continue to fall. "All these years, all this anger, I built an entire life on a lie. I became exactly the kind of person she feared I would become, someone incapable of accepting or giving true love." Emma moved closer to him, her shoulder brushing his gently. "It's not too late to change that, Thomas. Your mother left this journal as a gift, not just to explain but to set you free." He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. How do I even begin to undo years of... "One day at a time," she replied softly. "Starting by allowing yourself to feel Every bit of the pain, all the anger, all the love you've kept inside for so long. In that moment, something broke within Thomas. He let the journal fall gently into his lap and for the first time in years, allowed himself to truly cry. Emma enveloped him in her arms, holding him as deep sobs shook his body, years of repressed emotions finally finding release. The sun began to set, painting the attic in golden hues as Thomas finally calmed down. Still in Emma's arms, he felt different, lighter, as if an immense weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Thank you," he whispered against her neck. "For being here. For helping me see." Emma felt her heart race with the closeness, with the vulnerability of the moment. "Always," she replied simply. Thomas pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. There was something different in his gaze now, a depth, a truth she had never seen before. "Do you know what's most ironic?" he said with a small, sad smile. "My father knew exactly what he was doing when he chose you. He must have seen in you what my mother always wanted for me, someone who wasn't afraid to break through my defenses and show me that there's still beauty in the world." Emma felt her own tears begin to fall. "Your mother was right, you know? About you being worthy of love. You always were." The kiss came naturally like the sun setting on the horizon, inevitable, beautiful, and transformative. It wasn't a kiss of wild passion, but one of recognition, of two souls finally meeting in the midst of the storm. When they pulled apart, both knew that something fundamental had changed. Elizabeth's diary had been more than a revelation of the past. It had been a portal to a different future, one where masks were no longer needed and where love could blossom in the cracks of the walls they had built around their hearts. "Shall we go down?" Emma suggested softly after a moment. "We can make some tea and you can tell me more about her. All the happy memories you've kept for so long." Thomas nodded, carefully picking up the journal. "She would have loved you, you know," he said as they descended the attic stairs. "She always said that true beauty comes from within. I just had forgotten that for so long." That night, sitting in the library with cups of tea and the journal between them, Thomas and Emma began to weave a new story, one that wasn't based on appearances or expectations, but on truth, understanding, and a love that was only just beginning to bloom. And somewhere, Elizabeth Sterling smiled, knowing that her son had finally found his way back to the light. The Sterling mansion awoke differently that Monday. It was as if the air was lighter, as if the very walls were whispering secrets of hope long forgotten. In the kitchen, Emma was making breakfast when she heard a sound that made her heart stop for a moment. Soft piano notes floated down the hallway, hesitant but undeniably beautiful. Following the music, she found Thomas in the music room, sitting at the piano that had remained silent for so long. The morning light danced on his focused face as his fingers rediscovered melodies long buried in the past. It was her favorite song, he said without turning, sensing Emma's presence. Chopin Nocturne in E-flat major. She used to say that this music sounded like stars dancing in the night sky. Emma quietly approached, watching as his hands trembled slightly over the keys. Elizabeth's journal rested open on the piano, its yellowed pages holding more than memories. They held keys to a heart that was beginning to thaw. "Last night," Thomas continued, his voice soft, "I stayed up reading more of the journal. She wrote about how music was our secret language, how each melody told a story that words couldn't express." He paused, swallowing hard. "And after she left, I just stopped listening to the stories." Emma sat beside him on the piano bench, her shoulder gently brushing against his. "And now?" "Now." He breathed deeply, his fingers finding new notes. "Now it feels like every song is a letter from her. As if, through these melodies, she's still trying to tell me something." The music changed, turning into something softer, more hesitant. Emma recognized the melody. It was the same one Richard used to play on nights when the pain was most intense. "There's a passage in the journal," Thomas said, his voice choked, "where she talks about her greatest fear, not that I'd forget her, but that I'd forget who I was. That I'd build so many walls around me that I'd become a prisoner in my own fortress." His hand stopped over the keys, and the silence that followed was filled with contained emotion. Emma gently covered his hands with hers. "And she was right," he admitted, turning his palms up to interlace his fingers with hers. "I got so lost trying not to feel pain that I forgot what it was like to feel anything. But you're finding your way back," Emma whispered, squeezing his hands gently. Thomas turned to face her, and there was a vulnerability in his eyes that made her heart race. "Thanks to you," he said softly. "It's funny. My father always said that the true inheritance wasn't the money or the company, but the ability to love and be loved. I never really understood what he meant. Until now." The moment that followed was one of intimacy that transcended the physical. It was as if, for the first time, they were truly seeing each other, not through the lenses of the arrangement that brought them together, but through the eyes of the love that was beginning to blossom between them. "There's something I want to show you," Thomas said suddenly, standing up and extending his hand to her. Emma followed him through the corridors of the mansion until they reached a door she had never noticed before. The small office was exactly as Elizabeth had left it years ago. Unfinished paintings rested on easels covered in dust, dried tubes of paint scattered across a work table. But what caught Emma's attention was the covered canvas in the corner. Thomas walked over to it with reverence, carefully removing the cloth that protected it. The painting revealed made Emma gasp. It was a portrait of young Thomas, sitting at the piano with his father, both smiling with a joy so pure it seemed to illuminate the entire canvas. "She never finished it," Thomas explained, his voice almost a whisper. "It was the last thing she was working on before." He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Emma stepped closer to the painting, noticing the delicate details, the way Elizabeth had captured the light in her son's eyes, the love evident in the way Richard looked at the boy. In the journal, Thomas continued, she wrote that this painting was her attempt to capture not just a moment, but a promise. The promise that true love always finds its way back, no matter how long it takes or how many obstacles there are. He turned to Emma, and there was a new determination in his eyes. "I want to finish the painting," he said. "Not the way she started, but in a new way. I want to add you sitting here with us at the piano. Because you, Emma, you are the bridge that's bringing me back not just to her memories but to myself." Tears were now freely streaming down Emma's face. "Thomas? I know our marriage started as an arrangement," he interrupted her softly, moving closer to take her hands. "But it's becoming something even my father couldn't have predicted. You're not just helping me rediscover the man I was, you're helping me become the man I want to be." Emma felt her heart overflowing with emotion. "And what kind of man is that?" she asked softly. "Someone worthy of the love my mother had for me," he replied, his voice choking up. "Someone who can see beyond appearances and find beauty in imperfections. Someone capable of loving you the way you deserve to be loved." The kiss that followed was different from the first. It was no longer a hesitant discovery but a promise. A promise of healing, of growth, of a love that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. When they pulled apart, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "Stay with me," he whispered. "Not because a will demands it but because your heart wants to." "Always," Emma answered without hesitation. "As long as you promise to keep playing the piano for me." The smile that lit up Thomas's face was pure, genuine, an echo of the boy in the painting, but with the depth of the man he was learning to be. That afternoon, music once again filled the halls of Sterling Mansion. And this time, it wasn't just melodies from the past, it was promises of a future where true love had finally found its way back home. The autumn sun poured its golden light over the garden of Sterling Mansion, casting long shadows that danced among the last roses of the season. Emma paused for a moment before walking closer, her heart racing as she saw Thomas sitting on the old wooden bench, his mother's weathered journal resting in his lap like a sacred relic. 6 months had passed since that first night in the library, and time had carved deep changes not just in their lives, but in the very essence of who they were. The soft wind rustled the pages of the journal, carrying with it the fragrance of roses, the same ones Elizabeth Sterling had loved so much, the same ones Richard had kept alive all these years as a silent tribute to lost love. Emma felt the weight of the moment in each step she took toward the man she had learned to love, not despite his imperfections but through them. "I've been thinking," Thomas said softly as she sat beside him, his voice carrying a vulnerability that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. "About how sometimes we need to lose everything to find what really matters." Emma watched his profile against the fading light of the sunset, noticing every little change that time had brought. The eyes that once held nothing but arrogance and disdain now sparkled with a new depth. They were the eyes of someone who had learned that true strength isn't about building walls, but having the courage to tear them down. "Today is the last day," she gently reminded him, feeling the weight of those words hang in the air between them. The deadline set in Richard's will was drawing to a close, and with it, theoretically, the agreement that had brought them together would end. The tension of that knowledge hovered in the air like an unspoken question. Thomas took her hand, their fingers intertwining naturally, as if they had been made for this exact purpose. Emma noticed his hands were trembling slightly, not from fear but from contained emotion. "You know what's funny?" he said, a soft smile playing on his lips. "For the first time in my life, money is the last thing on my mind. This morning I woke up thinking about how strange it is. My father left me a fortune, but the real treasure he gave me was the chance to meet you." He opened the journal to a marked page, where Elizabeth's elegant handwriting filled the yellowed paper. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the words, as if they themselves were alive, pulsing with the truths they held. "My greatest wish for you, my son," he read aloud, his voice choked with emotion, "is that one day you find someone who loves you not for what you have, but for who you are. Someone who sees the light you carry inside, even when you can't see it yourself." Emma felt silent tears slide down her face as Thomas continued, each word resonating with a truth that transcended time. "Because true love, my dear, isn't about perfection, it's about seeing the beauty in each other's imperfections. It's about growing together, healing together, and turning the scars of the past into bridges to the future." The words lingered in the air like a blessing, carrying the weight of wisdom that had traveled through generations to find them in this very moment. Thomas gently closed the journal, his fingers caressing the worn cover as if he were touching his mother's very face. "My mother was describing you, Emma," he said, turning to face her with eyes bright with unshed tears. "She was describing the kind of love you taught me to believe in again. The kind of love that transforms, that heals, that makes us better. Not because it demands but because it inspires." From his coat pocket, he pulled out a small package wrapped in old yellowed tissue paper. His hands were visibly trembling now. "I found this in the studio last night," he explained, handing it to her. It was hidden in a box with her most cherished memories. With trembling hands, Emma unwrapped the package, revealing an old music box, its surface marked by time but still holding an ethereal beauty. When she opened it, a soft melody filled the air, the same notes Thomas had played that first morning on the piano, the music that had marked the beginning of their transformative journey. It was hers, he said softly, his voice little more than a whisper. "The last thing she touched before she left. And now I want it to be yours. Not as part of an agreement or an obligation, but as a symbol of everything we've built together. Of everything you've helped me rediscover." Emma touched the music box reverently, feeling under her fingers the small imperfections that made the object all the more precious. "Thomas?" "Wait," he gently interrupted, sliding off the bench to kneel before her. The setting sun turned the moment into something almost mythical, bathing them in a golden light that seemed to sanctify every word, every gesture. "There's something I need to say." Still holding her hand, Thomas continued, "6 months ago, I was a man living in a prison I built for myself. I used arrogance as a shield and loneliness as armor. I measured the value of people by the size of their bank accounts and the number of followers they had on social media. And then you came, without demands or judgments, but with patience and a love I didn't even know I deserved." Tears were now freely flowing down both their faces, each word carrying the weight of a deep and irreversible transformation. "You taught me that true beauty isn't in the perfection the world demands, but in the authenticity that few have the courage to show. You helped me rediscover not just the memories of my mother, but also the man she always knew I could become." Thomas took a small ring from his pocket, a delicate piece with a single pearl that shimmered softly in the fading light of the evening. "This was my mother's engagement ring," he explained, his voice trembling slightly. In the journal, she wrote that the pearl represented something precious born of adversity, just like true love is born from the imperfections that make us human. The garden seemed to hold its breath, as if nature itself were witnessing this sacred moment of transformation and rebirth. The last roses of autumn swayed gently in the breeze, their petals falling like silent blessings upon the couple. "Emma Collins," Thomas continued, his voice now steady despite the tears still streaming down his face, "our marriage started as a condition in a will. But today I want to ask you for something different. I want to ask you to continue this journey with me, not out of obligation but by choice. Not for a legacy of money but for a legacy of love." Emma could hardly see through the tears that blurred her vision. "Are you sure?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "You could have anyone. Someone who fits better into your world?" "I don't want anyone else," Thomas interrupted her with an intensity that made her heart race. "I don't want someone who fits into what I used to think was my world. I want you, with all your perfect imperfections, with all your gentle strength, with all the love you have the courage to give and receive. I want to build a new world with you, one not based on appearances and expectations, but on truth and real love." In the garden, the wind whispered through the flowers like an ancient love song, carrying echoes of all the love stories that had come before. Richard and Elizabeth, the past and the present, pain and healing, loss and rebirth. Then, Thomas took a deep breath, holding the ring with the pearl that shone like a promise. "Emma Collins Sterling, will you continue to be my wife? Not for 6 months but for a lifetime? Not by contract but by love?" Her answer came not just in words, but in a kiss that carried all the truth of their souls finally united, not out of duty but by a conscious and deep choice. It was a kiss that spoke of transformation, healing, and a love that transcended all the barriers society tried to impose. That night, sitting at the piano as they had so many times before, Thomas played the melody from the music box while Emma rested her head on his shoulder. The music flowed through the air like a blessing, echoing not only through the walls of the mansion but in the hearts of all who had witnessed this extraordinary journey of transformation. James, the butler who had served 3 generations of the Sterling family, smiled as he passed through the music room, silent tears streaming down his wrinkled face. In all his years of service he had never seen the mansion so alive, so full of true love. It was as if the very walls breathed more lightly, as if every room had been filled with a light no material wealth could buy. On the wall of the room, the new portrait that Thomas had completed perfectly captured this transformation. He and Emma sitting at the piano with the spirits of Richard and Elizabeth Sterling smiling softly in the blurred background. It was more than just a painting. It was a testament to how true love can transcend all barriers, heal all wounds, and transform even the hardest of hearts. The true legacy of Richard Sterling was not in the millions in his bank account or the business empire he built. It was in the wisdom to realize that his son needed not a material inheritance, but someone to help him rediscover his own humanity. And through Emma, Thomas didn't just find true love, he found himself. Because sometimes, the greatest treasure we can inherit is the courage to open our hearts and allow love to transform our imperfections into something extraordinarily beautiful. In the Sterling mansion, where once only whispered echoes of lost dreams and broken hearts lingered, now a new melody resonated, the music of true love, proving that sometimes the greatest miracles are born from the most unexpected moments. Dear viewers, if this story has touched your hearts, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Your words and experiences enrich our community. If you want more touching stories like this one, make sure to like and subscribe to the Life Stories channel. Together, we can continue exploring the endless possibilities of true love and personal transformation. Until the next story.